So we're going to move on to Troy Hall. She is with Oregon State University, and she's going to be talking to you about how humans interact with their environment. A lot of us, I think, have been fairly familiar with social sciences and consumers around a lot of recreation issues. So that's a piece of it, but I think she'll be also talking about just that broader interaction and those other sorts of things that people derive from the natural resource. So help me welcome Troy Hall.
Well, it's really great to be here. It's fun to be talking about stuff that's like my domain and not genomics, which I pretend to know something about now that I'm a department head in a very diverse department. So I'm happy to be here talking about social science. And lots of folks in the room that I know from many years. Some of you may know I did my PhD here, and I've worked a lot in Region 6, so it's really nice to be here today. So Cheryl asked us to talk about researchable questions, tools to help answer them, how information can be used in practical ways for land management, and to give some examples. And it was really tough to narrow down to a handful of things that I wanted to say, and I realize I stand between you and break, and you've been sitting for a couple hours, so I'm gonna just try to touch on a few key examples and ideas that will help get the juices flowing maybe for some discussion later this afternoon. So I'm going to talk about a few examples of work that I've been involved in, and just to illustrate a few of the things that we do in my form of social science. And so my orientation, when people ask me what kind of social scientist I am, I actually was trained as an anthropologist, but most of the work that I do now is out of a social psychological tradition, which means we focus on what's going on in people's heads and what they think, what they believe, what they value, like what Michael was talking about, how that influences their activity and engagement with resource management, how that affects their behaviors. And a lot of my work has been in developing and evaluating communication in different kinds of venues. So that's the perspective I'm bringing today to talking about what my kind of social science does. So I thought I would just illustrate three kinds of themes that are three of many, many themes of social science research that's useful in land management. And I chose to focus the first one on recreation and thinking about social science to describe recreation use and impacts. Some of this is observational work, field work, a little different from looking at surveys or interviews or focus groups. I'll give an example of social science used to describe and quantify public sentiments. Michael did a great job of illustrating one approach to that, and I'll look at another example or two, and then talk about social science in developing effective programs, policies, and actions, and wrap up with a few conclusions about the value of social science. So let's start out talking about social science used to describe recreation use and impacts. This is a key thing in national forest management because you're mandated to protect people's experiences. Recreation is a huge use of the national forest, maybe the dominant use these days. And we need information to understand what's going on when people are out there, why are they there, what are they getting from that experience. In some cases, you're required to do monitoring. How many of you love NVUM? Okay, me either. But you have to do some monitoring. And social science can help us develop effective recreation management strategies. What's the right approach to managing the visitors and managing the resource? So developing efficient and defensible protocols to monitor trends in recreation is an important thing that social scientists can bring. Resources are limited. We need creative, efficient ways to do sampling and track recreation. And there are a lot of tools available out there these days. So just as one example, I was involved with developing a national protocol that the Forest Service is using to monitor outstanding opportunities for solitude and wilderness. Wilderness areas, you're mandated to provide those kinds of outstanding opportunities, and we know that there have been changes in use in some wilderness areas. We didn't really have good tools for figuring out how could we do this in an efficient way. And so we worked on what is the purpose of this monitoring protocol, helping managers figure out efficient sampling protocols out on the ground to collect data, and then working on data collection and analysis. And this is something actually I worked on for us with John Allen and some of the original data that we collected 25 years ago. So what did we find? Well, this is simply one example from some sites in Mount Jefferson and Three Sisters Wilderness where we've seen some really interesting changes in recreation use over time. This is the mean number of encounters per day that a person would have out on the ground in the wilderness. So how many other people do you run into? And we use this as an indicator or proxy for those opportunities for solitude. And the original data were from 1991 to 1993, and then the most recent data, 2013 to 14. And you notice some interesting kinds of things going on, right? These are Cascade Crest wildernesses. These are all fairly accessible areas, and you see in some areas, wow, there's really no difference. And you can think, well, that's interesting, and that can maybe help us direct where we're putting management attention. But you look at a place like Green Lakes, holy cow, you go out there and you run into 325 people a day on average, and that's up from, well, what 62 was a lot, probably back in 1991 to 92. So these kind of data, by developing these protocols, easy tools to collect data, can really help focus management efforts on the ground, and maybe some unexpected findings too. A place right near Green Lakes, we see almost no change in encounter rates. Defensible data you can take to the public to talk about what's objectively going on the ground. That's not just my anecdotal impressions. So we can also collect data that helps us understand relationships between recreation use and impact. So the first example is simply describing what's going on out there, but understanding relationships is really important to be able to have management interventions. And a lot of work is focused on the relationship between recreation and biophysical conditions like vegetation, soil, some work on wildlife impacts. I love this picture from Half Dome in Yosemite, where the research was actually focused on things like safety and the crazy experience you have going up the cables on Half Dome. And that was actually, the research was used to guide setting some use limits on Half Dome. So an example of this is also from the Three Sisters Wilderness in the Obsidian Falls area. This was a place where 20 years ago, managers were concerned about increasing use. We were seeing a lot of increasing use. We were seeing expanding biophysical impacts on the ground, and we needed some data to help figure out how to manage this. And it was part of a much larger process that John Allen can tell you all about, or I could talk to you about too at a break if you're interested. But focusing here is like, what was the social science data that we could collect? So we were collecting information about recreation use. We were collecting information about encounters with people. We were collecting information about campsite impacts, campfire impacts. We were also doing some visitor surveys at the same time. And so all of that work culminated in a long process that resulted in some real substantive changes in management on the ground, including things like a campfire ban, closing some areas, and limited entry. It's one of two places in the Forest Service where, I believe 2 places in the Forest Service in the US where day use in wilderness is limited. And the initial data were great. They really helped us to set up being able to track changes over time. We were just back up looking at sites this last summer and being able to document the tangible impacts on the ground of improvements in site conditions and stabilization of that experience. It didn't become like Green Lakes. So turning to more on the survey side, less on the observational side, social science is useful for describing and quantifying public sentiment. This is probably what most people think of when they think of social science. We're doing surveys or interviews or focus groups. And why do we spend so much time on that? Well, part of it is about providing those high quality experiences, and we need to hear from people to know what's high quality. It's also important to help develop defensible actions using representative and objective data. I mean, we collect in-depth data often from non-representative samples for certain purposes, but often we do need to have representative defensible data. A long tradition in social science work has been focused on experience quality. Some of you may be familiar with the benefits-based management and the kinds of benefits that people associate with different sorts of recreational activities, and really helping managers focus on like, what are those things that impact experience quality. It's also really useful for understanding variation across stakeholder groups. Michael gave a good example of that with some of his work, and we often are profiling different kinds of user groups, profiling whether it's local visitors or non-local visitors, to really help understand when you hear in public comment periods or whoever shows up at your public meeting, that's generally not a representative sample of the public. And so we can collect data that help you contextualize those kind of findings, comments, in terms of a more representative sample of the public. And one example is some work we did in Hell's Canyon. I really like this example because I think it illustrates the value that social science brought to what was potentially a really politically divisive issue. You may know that recreation boating in Hell's Canyon is limited. There's commercial, and there's private, and there's float, and there's jet boat. Totally ripe for conflict. And the agency implemented restrictions, allocation, quite some time ago. And when I got involved in this, we were hearing from local private jet boaters that they felt like they were being discriminated against, that the float boaters really, they don't mind the jet boats so much. It's really okay. We should let more jet boats. And if you're going to have a jet boat free season, maybe we should have a float boat free season for the jet boaters. So, we're these comments, had congressionals come into our meetings, and so what we did was we designed a representative study where we could capture the different market segments, the different groups, and when we had challenges like, oh, I think your question wording is biased on the survey, we said, okay, how would you ask it? And we asked both ways. And that way, when you see the results that triangulate, it's like, wow, it's pretty hard to argue when the question you wrote generates certain kind of data. So we did on-site surveys. It was really primarily quantitative, as I said, across the different segments. And so this is just one little piece of the findings, and it's from float boaters, not jet boaters. I didn't want to overwhelm you with graphs. And what we asked was essentially on your trip, what things added or detracted from your experience on this scale from -3 really bad to +3. And fortunately, meeting Forest Service rangers was at least partly positive to commercial and private boaters. But you'll notice that for private float boaters, encountering power boaters is a pretty significant impact on their experience. And interestingly, for both commercial and private boaters, encountering other float boaters, they don't really care. And so we could come back and say, look, this is a representative view. In fact, we probably want to keep a non-motorized window because that is important to people's experience quality. That study in Hell's Canyon was really about experiences, but a lot of our work is assessing public support for different policies and practices. And so one study that I did with one of my graduate students, Chad Koistra, was in Grand County in Colorado, looking at what local residents felt should be done about pine beetle-infested forests. 3 million acres in the county, I think, were affected by pine beetles in the span of the outbreak, and it was huge. Many of you are probably familiar with that. And the local mayor and some of the local agency folks were really interested in would there be public support for doing something? The public hates clear cuts, right? They don't want us to go in and do stuff. So we did a representative sample of the permanent residents in the county. We used the phone book and did a mail survey. And we just asked things like support for action. And in fact, what we found was 80–90% of people actually thought selective thinning was appropriate and should be done, removing hazard trees, controlled burns. Even half of the respondents would support clear cuts, and most people didn't want no action. So there was really strong support in the community, and it helped frame communication and different programs. And then we dug in further. We wanted to understand what explained those attitudes, and we had attitudes about a number of different kinds of things, one of which was selective removal, that thinning. And interestingly, people often think that these attitudes break down on demographic lines, but similar to, I think, what Michael was talking about, we've largely unrelated to age, gender, education, political orientation. In fact, what really predicted people's views about management were their perceptions of the ecological risks of leaving these trees out there and the social risks. And what this does is it gives us an avenue for potentially communicating with people. Do they underestimate risks? Do they overestimate risks? These are kind of ways that we can engage with communication campaigns. So we were able to explain some of a decent, for social science, a decent percentage of their support for actions. So then the final way that I think social science is useful is developing and evaluating programs. We need to ensure that we're taking actions that are effective and that are acceptable, otherwise we end up in the litigation problem. I loved Cass's comment about educate, 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 right? That's what we always come back to, but it turns out education is often not a particularly effective kind of tool, or we don't do it very well. So social science can help us develop better policies and learn and adapt. And I have this particular picture up here because I think it really represents like good, effective communication. And you can see the little hand there. So what happened, this is at Sawtooth Lake in Idaho, and you have to boat across this lake to get to this trailhead to the wilderness, and you're required to have your dog on leash. And so you get 5 miles across this lake, and you realize you don't have a leash. What are you going to do, right? So the message could say, have a leash. Well, how many people are going to go home, right, and get a leash? So what they did was they put parachute cord there. That's the little hand. They basically provided leashes for people, right? So you could beat your head against the wall and say we need to educate and people should do the right thing, but really the most effective thing here was just a structural intervention. So I like that one. So a lot of really interesting work on where and why do regulations and communication work or not. And sorry, Willamette National Forest people, this is 25 years ago. So I'm demonstrating that we actually have improved. Believe it or not, when people would look at that sign with the map there and try to figure out like where they're supposed to camp and not have fires, they didn't really understand it very well. And you walk up to a trailhead board and it's 12-point font in bad laminated paper and it says pursuant to 36 CFR something. That's about as far as you get, right? So social science has really helped us develop much more effective ways to engage the public. So the one picture is also from the Sawtooth, and then I love this example. Each year, more than 200 people finish their hike like this. That's from Yosemite. These are really effective kinds of campaigns that are based on good social science theory. You don't say each year 0.00001% of people end up like this, right? You say 200 people. You use color, you use graphics, so lots of good social science theory around communication campaigns. So these are just a few examples, to get you thinking about the kinds of things and the kinds of tools that we can use from social psychological tradition. And just to reiterate, social science can help us set priorities, right? If you've got a whole range of things you can do, if you're trying to manage for experience quality, it can help you really identify where are the problems and what are the things that you need to be focusing on. Maybe there aren't problems. Somebody comes in, some squeaky wheel comes to you and you realize, well, that it's a squeaky wheel for them, but maybe not so much for other people. Very important, can help you collect valid data with the appropriate level of rigor. Not everything needs a giant representative survey, but sometimes you do. And so social scientists can help you sort through what is the appropriate kind of rigor and what are the appropriate kinds of data. Can help you anticipate support and opposition. The Grand County example is a good one, really demonstrated that there was widespread support for some of these actions, so that gave the local mayor the sort of grounding that he felt that he needed to go look for grant support to take some of these actions. And social science can help you identify and shape effective actions. So hopefully get to thinking a little, and we can talk more about it this afternoon. Thanks. Oh, awesome. Perfect. Yeah, this is a great question. So if you don't have the capacity to do the science yourself, how much can you extrapolate? And it's great that you asked that question because sometimes we really can. I've done a lot of research in wilderness, and the next time somebody comes to me and says, I need to do a study of my wilderness population, I'm going to push back and say, probably not. I mean, we studied across 36 wildernesses in Oregon and Washington, and we got really consistent findings. And so, I feel very confident, like within certain market segments that we're going to find certain things. And then also, when we look at the relationships, like the predictors of, say, support or opposition, those relationships tend to be more robust. The actual level of support or opposition may vary site to site, but often the predictors of those risk perceptions is a clear one, that if you understand risk perceptions. So I think you can learn a lot from previous research. Yeah, good question.
Different responses among the same group of stakeholders when asked the same questions, but at different times you come back in a resurvey, and they're telling you giving you different value sets.
Over what time frame are you talking?
Months to a couple of years.
Because I've done actually some of this work is we've done long-term research, and one of the things that we've been really surprised is how consistent the responses we've gotten across a 10 or 20-year time frame has been. So if you're asking people questions and 2 months later they're giving you a different answer, that might push you down the road of a different kind of approach to try to understand why. And I didn't mention this about the Grand County study, but we found some surprising findings from the surveys. And so what we did was we went and we did follow-up in-depth interviews with 35 of our respondents to help us understand why. Because if it's something that's deeply rooted to somebody's values, it's rare for them to change to completely just flip-flop. If it's something they've never thought about before and they tell you, oh, sure, I support blah, 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 and then they find out something more and they realize, oh, I didn't know what I was talking about, but if it's really rooted to core values, it's unlikely for people to change radically without something going on. That's right.
And in a lot of cases, when we're trying to manage a force, we're trying to get ahead of the 2009 picture. And I just wonder if you'd asked those same questions in 2005, when it looked green, if you would have had as much pressure to, let's do something. So I want you to
That's actually a really good point. So the question is like with Grant County, where asking questions when the forest is green, you probably wouldn't have support for thinning and clear cutting and so on. But when people see it gray or brown, red or gray, and that's absolutely right. And there is some research on sort of longitudinal trends in people's attitudes, specifically related actually to forest pests. And because their risk perceptions changed, right? When the trees were green, they didn't perceive risk. Now that they're dead, they really perceive the risk. So that's absolutely right.
I would argue that in your case, it could also possibly be that it's a flawed research design. And it just raises the obvious. Not all social science is good social science.
Amen to that. Yeah.
But that would be one place I would automatically go to make sure that the research design itself is good.
That's right. Yeah. So if you ever get a survey from the Democratic or Republican Party, those are ways not to ask questions. Yeah. Everybody's a survey designer, right? I mean, I have probably made every possible mistake in designing a survey. So, come talk to us because we can tell you what not to do.